My whole family is here, my support system. Change is scary, I acknowledged. When I moved back here from the city, even though it was only 30 miles, it felt like a major life upheaval. She nodded. Exactly. Plus, there's the financial aspect. Miller offered a partial scholarship, but it's still going to mean significant loans. Have you looked into industry fellowships? My firm sponsors 2 urban planning graduate students each year. The application deadline is coming up, but I could put in a good word. Her eyes widened. Are you serious? That would be amazing. I can't guarantee anything, I cautioned. The selection committee is independent, but your work is impressive, Emma. Your architectural perspective would bring something valuable to urban planning. Thank you, she said, with a sincerity that made something shift in the atmosphere between us. Not just for this, but for everything. Taking a chance on a random student who showed up on your doorstep, sharing your family's history, encouraging me. There was a weight to her words that suggested more than professional gratitude, a current of connection that had been building subtly during our Tuesday conversations. At 33 to her 25, I'd been careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, viewing our relationship as mentorship rather than acknowledging the growing personal interest I felt. It's been my pleasure, I said carefully. The house has felt more alive with you in it, seeing it through fresh eyes. A charged silence fell between us, broken only when Emma glanced at her watch and started slightly. I should go. I promised Mom I'd help her with dinner tonight. Ethan's bringing his new girlfriend home to meet the family. Of course. I walked her to the door, where she paused, turning back with an uncharacteristic nervousness. I was wondering, would you like to get coffee sometime? Somewhere that's not your kitchen, I mean. She rushed on before I could respond. Or dinner? My project is done, so there's no academic conflict or anything. Just 2 adults who enjoy each other's company. The invitation hung in the air between us, transforming our dynamic in one sentence. I hesitated, caught between attraction and caution. Emma, I'm flattered, but I'm quite a bit older than you. 8 years, she countered. Hardly a scandalous gap between 2 adults. She had me there. The age difference wasn't truly what gave me pause. It was the sense that any step in this direction would irreversibly change something precious. Our Tuesday conversations, the comfortable rapport we'd developed, the uncomplicated pleasure of seeing the house through her eyes. Let me think. About it, I offered, not wanting to dismiss the possibility outright, but needing time to process this shift. She nodded, disappointment flickering across her features before she masked it with a bright smile. Of course. No pressure. I'll see you next Tuesday? Next Tuesday, I confirmed. After she left, I found myself standing in the middle of the entryway, uncertain why I'd hesitated. Emma was intelligent, passionate, easy to talk to, qualities I valued highly. Yet something held me back, some nebulous concern I couldn't quite articulate even to myself. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Vivian's name flashed on the screen. Perfect timing, I answered. I was just having an existential crisis and could use a distraction. Her laugh came through clearly. Glad to be of service. What's the crisis? I hadn't intended to actually share my dilemma, but found myself explaining anyway. Emma Reeves just asked me out, on an actual date. The architecture student? Vivian sounded intrigued rather than scandalized. And this is a crisis because she's 25, I'm 33, she's a student, I've been mentoring her. She's an adult woman pursuing a professional degree, not some impressionable undergraduate, Vivian pointed out pragmatically. And 8 years is nothing. David is 12 years older than me, and Edward was 14 years older than me. I hadn't considered that parallel. Fair point. So what's the real issue, Alex? Because I don't think it's the age gap. Leave it to Vivian to cut straight to the heart of the matter. I'm not sure, I admitted. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Or maybe you're finally ready to consider letting someone new into your life, and that's terrifying. Her voice softened. Edward mentioned once that you hadn't dated seriously since Melissa broke your engagement. That was what, 4 years ago? 5, actually, but I was surprised my father had discussed my romantic life with Vivian. Something like that? Look, I'm the last person who should be giving relationship advice, she continued. But I do know something about second chances and unexpected connections. Sometimes the timing is just right, even when all logical considerations suggest otherwise. Is that wisdom from personal experience? Very good, actually. I'm going to sell the condo, moving in with David next month. The news shouldn't have surprised me given their obvious connection at the housewarming party, but it still represented a significant milestone. Vivian truly. Moving on, building a life completely separate from her time with my father. Congratulations, I wrote back. Dad would be happy for you. Her response was simple but heartfelt. Thank you, Alex. That means more than you know. As I set down my phone, I found myself thinking about the strange path that had led me back to this house. A sold sign that had ignited indignation, a hidden deed that had given me unexpected leverage, a father's foresight in creating a trust that allowed for compromise. If any single element had been different, where would we all be now? Vivian might be unhappily rattling around in a house too full of memories. I might be visiting occasionally, but remaining disconnected from my family legacy. Emma Reeves might never have developed her passion for historical architecture. Instead, each of us had found our way to a future that somehow felt right. Unexpected. Unplanned, but right. Perhaps that was the greatest legacy my father had left behind. Not the house itself, but the chain of events his careful planning had set in motion, leading each of us to where we needed to be. Chapter 11. Spring's Promise. Emma Reeves became a regular visitor over the following weeks, stopping by on Tuesday afternoons to take additional measurements, photographs, and notes for her project. What had begun as professional courtesy, on my part, evolved into genuine anticipation of her visits. She brought a fresh perspective to the house, seeing historical significance and architectural beauty in details I'd taken for granted my entire life. Do you realize, she said, one gray March afternoon, that the stained glass in the dining room windows was likely crafted by the Harlan Studios? They were among the premier artisans of decorative glass in the 1920s. See this particular blue shade? She pointed to a section of the peacock design. That's their signature color. Very difficult to achieve with the technology of the time. I'd eaten thousands of meals beneath those windows without ever considering their artistic or historical value. My great-grandfather must have commissioned them specifically for the house. Absolutely, Emma nodded enthusiastically, and they would have been enormously expensive. The equivalent of putting in custom Tiffany windows today. Her excitement was contagious, making me see my inheritance not just as a family home, but as a piece of living history, one I was now responsible for preserving. On the third Tuesday in March, Emma arrived with a large presentation board and a nervous smile. I got an A on my project, she announced as I ushered her in from the rain. Professor Hargrove said it was one of the most thorough historical analyses he'd seen from an undergraduate. I thought you might like to have this copy. She handed me the board, which featured a detailed architectural evolution of the house, from original blueprints to various additions and modifications over the decades, complemented by beautiful photographs and insightful annotations. Emma, this is incredible, I said, genuinely impressed by the professional quality of her work. Thank you. She blushed slightly. It's the least I could do after you let me invade your home multiple times. Besides, I thought it might be nice for you to have the full architectural history documented in one place. It's perfect. I'll hang it in the study. We'd fallen into a comfortable routine during her visits. Architecture talk followed by coffee, in the kitchen, and increasingly personal conversations. I'd learned that she was the first in her family to attend college, that her twin brother Ethan was studying engineering at State, that her parents had eventually purchased a newer, more practical home in the suburbs, but still occasionally drove past the one that got away. Today, as we settled at the kitchen island with steaming mugs, Emma seemed preoccupied, fidgeting with her spoon more than usual. Everything okay? I asked. Beyond the A on your project, I mean. She took a deep breath. I have some news. I've been accepted to the Urban Planning Master's program at Miller School of Design. Emma, that's fantastic. Miller is one of the top programs in the country. I raised my mug in a toast. Congratulations. Thanks, she smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. It's an amazing opportunity. But, I prompted, sensing hesitation beneath her words. But it's in Chicago. I'd be moving at the end of summer. She stared into her coffee. I've never lived outside of this city. Exactly. When we finally reached the attic, converted decades ago into a partial living space with dormered windows overlooking the backyard, Emma gasped at the view of the ancient oak tree, now bare of leaves but majestic in its winter skeleton. "That tree must be even older than the house," she marveled. "It is. My great-grandfather built here specifically because he fell in love with that oak." I joined her at the window. 4 generations of Collins kids have climbed it. My father painted stars on my bedroom ceiling so I could feel like I was up in its branches even at night. Emma smiled. "That's beautiful. A living connection to your ancestors." She hesitated, then asked softly, "Is that why you couldn't sell the family history?" The question was personal, perhaps too personal from a stranger, but something about Emma's genuine interest made me want to answer honestly. "Partly," I admitted, "but it's more complicated than that. My stepmother tried to sell without realizing I owned half the house through my mother's will. By the time we sorted it all out, well, we found a different solution." "I'm glad you did," Emma said with surprising sincerity. "This house belongs with people who understand its soul." The phrase, so similar to what my father had always said about houses having souls, caught me off guard. "That's an unusual way to put it." She blushed slightly. "Sorry, I get a bit poetic about old houses. They've seen so much life, you know, all that history soaked into the walls." "No, I like it." My dad used to say something similar. For a moment we stood in comfortable silence, gazing out at the oak tree and the winter garden beyond. Then Emma glanced at her watch and gasped. "I've taken up your entire afternoon. I'm so sorry. I had no idea it had gotten so late." I waved away her concern. "It's been interesting. Actually, I've noticed some architectural details today that I'd never paid attention to before, seeing the house through your eyes." She beamed at the compliment. Would it be completely pushing my luck to ask if I could come back sometime? There are a few more measurements I'd like to take for the project, and maybe, I prompted when she trailed off, maybe pick your brain about urban planning. I'm considering it for my master's focus next year. I found myself nodding before I'd fully thought it through. "Sure. I'm usually working from home on Tuesdays and Fridays. Just text me first." I pulled out a business card and scribbled my cell number on the back. She accepted it with obvious delight. "Thank you so much, Mr. Collins. This has been incredibly helpful." "Alex," I corrected, walking her back downstairs. "Mr. Collins was my father." "Alex," she repeated with a small smile. "And I'm Emma, not Miss Reeves." As I watched her hurry down the front walk to her car, portfolio clutched protectively against the light drizzle that had started, I felt an unexpected lightness. There was something refreshing about her enthusiasm, her genuine appreciation for the house and its history. I returned to my study, but found it difficult to concentrate on the municipal zoning report I'd been reviewing before Emma's arrival. Instead, I found myself looking around the room with fresh eyes, noticing details I'd grown up with but never truly seen. The way the afternoon light filtered through the leaded glass of the built-in bookcases, the subtle pattern in the original. Hardwood floors, the precise craftsmanship of the crown molding that had been installed by hand a century ago. This house was more than my inheritance. It was a living repository of my family's story. And somehow, sharing it today, even with a stranger, had deepened my connection to it rather than diminishing it. I picked up my phone and, on impulse, texted Vivian. "Just had the strangest visit from one of the would-be buyers of the house. Architecture student doing a project. Small world. She's one of David's students." Her reply came quickly. "Emma or Ethan Reeves? The twins whose parents were buying." "Emma," I responded. She's passionate about historical architecture, made me see the house with new eyes. A moment passed. Then, funny how life works out. If I'd sold to them, you'd never have moved back in, and she'd never have gotten to study the house she almost grew up in. Somehow, this outcome seems right for everyone. It was the most philosophical I'd ever known Vivian to be, and I wondered if David's academic influence was rubbing off on her. "How are things with you two?" I texted, realizing I hadn't checked in with her in several weeks. "Good. I'm looking for Alex Collins?" "That's me." Relief washed over her features. "Oh, good. I was afraid you might have moved or something. I'm Emma Reeves. I I'm not sure how to explain this without sounding weird. Try anyway, I suggested, intrigued despite my caution. She took a deep breath. I grew up in this house. Well, I was supposed to. My parents were about to buy it last year, but the sale fell through at the last minute. She gestured to the portfolio in her arms. I'm an architecture student, and I did my semester project on this house. Historical significance, architectural evolution, the works. I was hoping I might see inside, just once. Understanding dawned. This was one of the twins-to-be, part of the young couple Vivian had been about to sell to. You're one of the buyers who almost purchased the house. My parents, yeah. She nodded. Mom and Dad were heartbroken when it fell through. They'd already started planning the nursery for me and my brother. She gave a self-deprecating laugh. I mean, not that we were born yet or anything. Mom was 5 months pregnant with us when they made the offer. I hesitated, then pushed open the storm door. Come in. I could use a break from work anyway. Emma's eyes widened with delight as she stepped into the foyer, her gaze immediately drawn to the architectural details. The original crown molding, the built-in bookshelves, the carved newel post on the staircase. It's even more beautiful than the real estate photos, she breathed. Look at this craftsmanship. They just don't build houses like this anymore. Her genuine appreciation for the home's character was endearing. How did you end up doing a project on this specific house? I asked, leading her into the living room. She set her portfolio on the coffee table, carefully avoiding the coaster I'd instinctively pushed toward her. When the sale fell through, I was actually relieved in a way. My parents were devastated, but I'd been secretly worried about them taking on such an old house with twins on the way. All that maintenance, you know? But I couldn't stop thinking about the place. So, when we had to choose a historical property to study for our architectural preservation class, this seemed perfect. And your research brought you to my doorstep? Emma nodded, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. I tracked the ownership, records at the county assessor's office, and found your name. Then, a simple Google search led me to your firm's website. I was planning to email you, but then I thought, why not just come by? Worst case, you'd say no. Brave, I commented, genuinely impressed by her initiative. Desperate, she corrected, with a grin. The project is due next week, and I still need interior photos and measurements. Professor Hargrove is a stickler for thoroughness. David Hargrove, at Westfield University? Her eyes widened. You know him, I chuckled. I know of him. He's dating my stepmother, actually. Small world, Emma said, looking genuinely delighted by the connection. He's brilliant but terrifying. His red pen is legendary among the architecture. Students. So I've heard. I gestured around the room. Well, since you're practically family through the David Hargrove connection, feel free to take all the photos and measurements you need. I can give you a tour, point out some of the original features versus later additions. For the next 2 hours, we moved through the house room by room, Emma snapping photos and taking notes with the focused intensity of someone truly passionate about her subject. Her questions were insightful, demonstrating a genuine understanding of historical architecture and preservation principles. In my father's study, my study now, she paused before the wall of framed architectural drawings, her expression reverent. These are incredible, she murmured, leaning closer to examine one particular sketch. Original Collins designs? I nodded, pride warming my chest. My great-grandfather's work, mostly. He designed the house in 1923. Some are my grandfather's, and a few are my father's. Your family has a serious architectural legacy. She glanced at me. Do you design too? Urban planning, I explained. The macro view rather than the micro. But I appreciate the art of it. Emma turned back to the drawings, studying them with visible admiration. These should be in a museum or university archive. They're historical treasures. They belong in this house, I said simply. The designs and the building they created, they're part of the same story. She nodded, understanding. Living history. That's what makes this place so special. It's not just preserved in amber. It's evolved with each generation while maintaining its essential character. The observation, so similar to my own thoughts the night of the housewarming, struck a chord. They balanced each other well. A comfortable silence fell between us as we continued our impromptu cleanup assembly line. Finally, Vivian spoke, her voice softer. I want to thank you, Alex. For inviting you tonight. It seemed like the natural thing to do. She shook her head. Not just that. For everything. The way you handled the house situation. For being fair when you could have been vindictive. For making space for me in your father's memory instead of trying to erase me from it. Her candor caught me off guard. We'd reached a civil understanding over the past months, even a cautious rapport, but we'd carefully avoided such direct acknowledgments of our journey from adversaries to whatever we were now. Not quite family, but connected nonetheless. I think we both did the best we could with a difficult situation, I said finally, and Dad would be pleased to see us standing in his kitchen washing dishes together instead of facing off with lawyers. She smiled, handing me the last glass. Indeed he would. She hesitated, then added, David asked me to move in with him. That's fast, I said, then immediately regretted the judgment in my tone. But Vivian just nodded, unbothered. It is, and at our age, that's rather the point. We don't have the luxury of time that you younger people do. She dried her hands on a kitchen towel. I haven't given him an answer yet. Part of me thinks it's ridiculous. I've just settled into my new place, just started finding my footing as independent Vivian rather than Edward's wife or Alex's adversary. But, I prompted, sensing there was more. But when you've experienced real loss, you become acutely aware of how precious time is. She leaned against the counter, suddenly looking vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. I loved your father, Alex. It wasn't the grand passion of youth. We were both too old and too practical for that. But it was real. And it was good. And when he died, I thought that chapter of my life was closed for good. And now? Now I'm considering the possibility of another chapter. Different, unexpected, but potentially wonderful in its own way. She looked at me directly. I wanted you to know. It felt important somehow. I was touched by her desire for my understanding, perhaps even my blessing. Dad would want you to be happy, Vivian. I want that too. Relief washed over her features. Thank you. That means more than you might think. She straightened, her usual composure returning. Now, I should rescue David from the urban planning lecture and head home. It's been a lovely evening, Alex. The house feels alive again. As I watched her rejoin David in the living room, I was struck by how much had changed in the months since I'd first seen that sold sign. The house remained in the family, yes, but more importantly, both Vivian and I had found a way forward that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. Maybe that was the true legacy my father had left us, not the physical structure of wood and stone, but the understanding that homes, like the people who inhabit them, can evolve while maintaining their essential character. The party wound down shortly after, guests departing with warm hugs and promises to get together again soon. As I closed the door behind the last visitor, I found myself alone in the house that had witnessed 4 generations of my family's history. Births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, all absorbed into its very walls. But for the first time since moving in, the solitude felt peaceful rather than melancholy. The house was no longer a shrine to the past, but a living space with room for new memories, new traditions, new beginnings. I made my way to my father's study, now my study, and poured a small measure of the Scotch Harold had brought. Raising the glass in a silent toast to absent loved ones, I felt a profound sense of rightness settle over me. Home at last. Chapter 10. The Unexpected Visitor. 3 months after the housewarming party, on a dreary February afternoon, I was working from home in my father's old study when the doorbell rang. Unusual for a Tuesday at 2 p.m. I wasn't expecting any deliveries, and most of my neighbors were at work. I made my way to the front door, peering through the sidelight to see a young woman standing on the porch, clutching a leather portfolio, and looking nervously at the house. Something about her seemed vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place her. Mid-20s, shoulder-length brown hair, large eyes behind fashionable glasses. "Can I help you?" I asked, opening the door but keeping. The storm door closed between us. She startled slightly, then squared her shoulders. "Thank you. Come in, both of you. There's food in the dining room, drinks in the living room, and a house tour happening sporadically whenever someone looks curious enough about a closed door." As they moved past me into the foyer, I caught Vivian's subtle squeeze of David's hand, a small, intimate gesture that spoke volumes. She was moving on, building a new life. The realization brought a surprising sense of satisfaction rather than the resentment I might have expected months ago. Throughout the evening, I found myself observing Vivian and David together. He was a professor of literature at the local university, I'd learned, with a specialty in 19th century American writers. Nothing like my father, with his practical architectural mind and business-like approach to life. Yet Vivian seemed at ease with him in a way I'd rarely seen her with Dad. They moved through the gathering with a comfortable synchronicity, David's quiet humor complementing Vivian's more polished social grace. "They make a good pair," Harold commented, appearing at my elbow as I watched them from across the room. Not what I expected, but sometimes life has a peculiar way of sorting things out. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. She mentioned meeting someone, but I had no idea it was serious. Harold sipped his scotch. "About 3 months, from what I gather. David handled her condo purchase. He does some real estate law on the side. One thing led to another." The symmetry wasn't lost on me. My father had met Vivian through a professional connection as well. "She seems happy," I observed. "As do you," Harold countered, giving me a shrewd look. "The house suits you, Alex, or perhaps you suit it." Before I could respond, Mrs. Landon approached, her eyes bright with the excitement of gossip. "Alexander, your father's study looks wonderful. You've preserved all his architectural drawings, so important for the family history. Will you be following in his footsteps professionally? I know you work in design." "Urban planning, actually," I corrected gently. "Dad designed buildings. I helped design the spaces between them. Similar mindset, different scale." "Ah, well, the talent clearly runs in the family. Speaking of family," she leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "I couldn't help but notice your stepmother has brought a gentleman friend. So, soon after Edward's passing, though I suppose it has been over a year now." The judgment in her tone was unmistakable. I found myself bristling on Vivian's behalf, an unexpected reaction that surprised me as much as my next words. "Dad would have wanted her to be happy," I said firmly. "They seem well suited, don't you think? And David's a literature professor. Dad would have enjoyed their conversations about the classics." Mrs. Landon blinked, clearly taken aback by my defense. "Well, yes, I suppose that's one way to look at it." "It's the only way that matters," I replied, keeping my tone light but firm. "More wine?" As the evening progressed, I found myself drawn into conversation after conversation, playing host in the house where I'd once been simply a child. It felt strange and yet fitting, like slipping into a role I'd been rehearsing for without realizing it. Near 11, as the gathering began to naturally wind down, I found Vivian alone in the kitchen, rinsing glasses and loading them into the dishwasher, despite my protest that I'd handle cleanup tomorrow. "Old habits," she shrugged when I tried to shoo her away from the sink. "Besides, David is deep in conversation with your colleague Jason about sustainable urban development. I needed a break before my eyes glazed over completely." I laughed, picking up a dish towel to dry the wine glasses she deemed too delicate for the dishwasher. "Jason has that effect on people. Brilliant guy, but he can talk about municipal zoning codes for hours." "Reminds me of Edward when he'd get going about load-bearing walls and cantilevers," she said, a fond smile playing at her lips. The comparison startled me, not because it wasn't apt, but because it was the first time I'd heard Vivian mention my father with such unguarded affection. Usually, references to him came with a slight tension, as if she were carefully measuring her words around me. Dad could definitely monologue when he was passionate about something, I agreed. Mom used to set a timer at dinner when he started talking about a new project. 20 minutes, then we had to change the subject. Vivian laughed, the sound genuine and warm. I wish I'd known her. She sounds like she really understood him. She did. I carefully dried a crystal wine glass that had belonged to my grandmother. She'd started taking classes at the local community college, interior design, a passion she'd set aside during her marriage, and had recently mentioned meeting someone, though she remained vague on details. Our relationship had evolved into something neither of us could have predicted. Not quite friendship, but a complex bond formed through shared connection to my father and mutual respect that had developed through the process of untangling his estate. We met for coffee every few weeks, sharing updates and occasionally even memories of Dad. The rental arrangement for the house had been put on hold once I decided to move in, though we'd agreed to revisit the financial aspects in a year. For now, the trust funds earmarked for maintenance were covering the property taxes and insurance, with Vivian and I splitting any additional expenses that arose. It wasn't the outcome either of us had initially wanted, but somehow it had become the right one for both of us. Vivian had her fresh start and financial security. I had preserved the family legacy while creating space for my own future within it. As I turned to head back inside, my gaze fell on the oak tree where we'd recovered the time capsule. On impulse, I walked over to it, placing my hand against its rough bark. 4 generations of Colin's children had climbed this tree. Saturday evening arrived with unexpected nerves fluttering in my stomach. It had been years since I'd hosted a gathering of any kind, and tonight's guest list represented an odd amalgamation of my worlds. Old neighborhood friends who remembered me as a child, colleagues from my architectural firm in the city, my father's longtime friends, and, most surprisingly, Vivian. I'd spent the day in a frenzy of last-minute preparations, arranging furniture that was still finding its place in the old house, setting up a makeshift bar on the antique sideboard in the dining room, and preparing platters of appetizers that I hoped would seem sophisticated rather than haphazard. At precisely 5:55 p.m., the doorbell rang. I smoothed down my shirt, took a deep breath, and opened the front door to find Harold Abernathy standing on the porch, a bottle of expensive scotch in hand. Harold, I smiled, genuinely pleased to see him. Right on time. Military precision. He winked, stepping inside. Some habits die hard, even 50 years after leaving the service. He handed me the bottle. Your father's favorite. Seemed appropriate for the occasion. I accepted the gift with a lump in my throat. It is. Thank you. Harold glanced around the entryway, nodding approvingly at the subtle changes I'd made. Fresh paint and a warm cream that brightened the space, the antique console table restored to its original luster, family photos once again adorning the walls, though I'd reframed them in more contemporary settings. You've struck a good balance, he commented, honoring the past while making it your own. Edward would approve. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang again. Within 30 minutes, the house was filled with conversation and laughter, the rooms coming alive in a way they hadn't since before my father's illness. My colleague Sophia had brought her husband and their 2 young children, who were currently fascinated by the stars painted on my childhood bedroom ceiling, still glowing after all these years, though I'd refreshed them with new paint. I was pouring wine for Mrs. Landon, my parents' next-door neighbor for 30 years, when Vivian arrived. She looked different somehow, more relaxed, her usual designer outfit replaced by stylish but comfortable dark jeans and a soft blue sweater that brought out her eyes, her hair falling in loose waves rather than her signature structured style. And she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man about my father's age, tall with silver hair and kind eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses. He carried a potted plant despite my explicit no gifts instruction. Alex, Vivian smiled, the expression genuinely warm. I hope you don't mind that I brought David. He insisted on coming even after I told him it would be awkward. The man, David, chuckled good-naturedly. I believe what she actually said was excruciating, but I've developed a thick skin over the years. He extended his hand. David Mercer. And before you ask, yes, distant relation, very distant cousin, which makes this whole situation even more ironically tangled. I shook his hand, intrigued despite myself. Alex Collins, welcome to our excruciating evening. Vivian rolled her eyes, but her expression remained light. I brought wine despite your orders not to, and David insisted on this. She nodded toward the plant. Peace lily, David explained, supposedly good for purifying the air, though primarily, I thought the symbolism might be appropriate. It was a thoughtful gesture, unexpectedly so, but a good life, filled with more love than most people are lucky enough to know. First with your mother, who remains the great love of my youth, and then in a different but no less meaningful way with Vivian, who brought light back into my days, when I thought all brightness had gone out of the world. Whatever happens after I'm gone, try to remember that complex truths can coexist. That loving Vivian didn't diminish my love for your mother. That moving forward doesn't mean forgetting what came before. The house you're standing in front of has sheltered 4 generations of our family. It may shelter 4 more, or its story in our family may be ending. Either way, the memories remain, the love remains, the legacy of who we are continues through you. I'm proud of the man you've become, Alex, strong enough to stand your ground when it matters, wise enough, I hope, to know when to let go. With all my love, today and always. Dad. I lowered the letter, aware of tears tracking silently down my cheeks. Dad's words, his final communication to me, written knowing I might not find it for years, if ever, cut through the remaining tangles of resentment and grief, leaving only love and a profound gratitude for having been his son. Wordlessly, I passed the letter to Vivian. She hesitated, giving me a questioning look. "He'd want you to read it," I said. "It mentions you." As she read, I picked up my childhood letter to myself, smiling through my tears at the earnest hopes of 8-year-old Alex. "I hope you're a famous baseball player or maybe an astronaut. Do you have a cool car? Did you meet Ken Griffey Jr. yet?" When Vivian finished Dad's letter, she carefully refolded it and handed it back to me, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "He always did know the right thing to say," she murmured. "Not always," I countered with a watery chuckle. "But when it really mattered, yeah." We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Vivian spoke. "I found a condo I'm interested in Greenwood Village, not too far from here." "That's good," I nodded. "Nice area." "It's about half the size of this place. No yard to maintain. Walking distance to shops and restaurants." She sipped her coffee, which must have gone cold by now. "A fresh start. When would you move?" "The end of next month, assuming the offer is accepted." She glanced at me. "What about you? Have you decided what you'll do with the house?" I shook my head, looking out at the massive oak tree that had stood sentinel over the property for nearly a century. "Not entirely. I'm thinking of living here part-time at first. Weekends, holidays, see how it feels. And then, we'll see." I carefully returned the items to the time capsule, but kept out Mom's ring and Dad's final letter. These felt too precious to rebury, too meaningful to consign back to the earth. "One day at a time." Vivian nodded, understanding in her eyes. One day at a time. As we sat there on the porch of the house that had belonged to my family for generations, I felt something shift between us. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect born of shared loss and unexpected connection. We'd both loved Edward Collins in different ways and at different times, and now we were both learning to navigate a world without him, finding our separate paths forward while honoring what had come before. Dad would have liked that, I thought. It wasn't the outcome he'd planned, but maybe it was the one he'd hoped for all along. Chapter 8. New Beginnings. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, much like the one when I'd first seen the sold sign, I stood in the driveway watching a moving truck pull away from the house. But this time, instead of taking away pieces of my family history, it was bringing in new life. My furniture from the city apartment I decided to sublet while I gave living in the family home a trial run. The house looked different now. The IMO roof had been replaced, the electrical system updated, the foundation repaired. Inside, I'd made some changes too, keeping the architectural integrity and historical elements that made the house special, while updating where needed to make it feel like my own space rather than a museum to the past. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Housewarming still on for Saturday? V." I smiled, typing back, "Absolutely. 6 p.m.? Bringing anything is forbidden. You've seen how much unpacking I still have to do." Vivian had been settled in her condo for nearly 4 months. Now the transition seemingly good for her. Equipped with a small garden shovel, I made my way to the massive oak tree in the front yard, looking for the small marker that indicated where Dad and I had buried our time capsule 23 years ago. "Are you actually going to dig it up?" I turned to find Vivian watching me from the porch, a cup of coffee in her hands. She was dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt, a stark contrast to the polished, perfectly coiffed woman I was used to seeing. "I've been thinking about it for weeks," I admitted. "It feels like the right time." She nodded, descending the porch steps. "Need help?" The offer surprised me, but I nodded, moving aside to make room for her beside the tree. She set her coffee on a nearby garden bench and joined me in searching for the marker. There, she pointed to a small flat stone with a childish handprint pressed into cement. That must be it. I knelt beside the stone, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation. What would my 8-year-old self have considered important enough to preserve for the future? What would Dad's letter to his future self contain? How deep did you bury it? Vivian asked, kneeling beside me despite the risk to her designer jeans. Not very. Maybe a foot or so? I began carefully digging around the marker, not wanting to damage anything in the process. We worked in companionable silence, taking turns with the shovel until the blade struck something solid about 14 inches down. Carefully, I cleared away the remaining dirt to reveal a metal box, an old ammunition case that Dad had repurposed, sealed with heavy-duty waterproof tape. Moment of truth, I murmured, lifting the box from its resting place. It was heavier than I remembered, suggesting Dad might have added items without my knowledge. We carried it to the porch, where I used a pocket knife to carefully cut through the aged tape. The seal broke with a soft hiss, suggesting the waterproofing had held for all these years. Vivian hovered nearby, clearly curious but maintaining a respectful distance. Do you want privacy for this? I considered for a moment, then shook my head. No, it's fine. Dad would probably get a kick out of us doing this together, actually. The comment earned a small smile as she settled into one of the wicker porch chairs. What's in it? I opened the lid and began carefully removing items, laying them on the small table between us. Baseball cards, my prized Ken Griffey Jr. rookie, card that's probably worth something now, a Hot Wheels car, some comic books. Each item triggered a flood of memories, transporting me back to a simpler time when my biggest concern was whether the Mariners would make the playoffs. Near the bottom, wrapped in plastic, were the letters. One in my childish scrawl addressed to Future Alex, and one in Dad's neat architect's handwriting addressed to Edward Collins 2030. I set them aside for a moment, continuing to explore the contents. Beneath the letters was a small velvet pouch I didn't recognize. This wasn't here when we buried it, I murmured, carefully opening the drawstring. Inside was a woman's ring, a delicate silver band set with a small sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. Mom's engagement ring. Dad must have added it later. Vivian leaned forward, studying the ring with genuine admiration. It's beautiful, understated but elegant. Just like her. I turned the ring in my fingers, memories of seeing it on my mother's hand flooding back. I didn't know Dad had kept this. I assumed he'd buried it with her. There's an envelope underneath it, Vivian pointed out, gesturing to the box. Sure enough, a small envelope labeled simply, "For Alex," lay at the very bottom of the container. The handwriting was unmistakably Dad's, but shakier than the letter addressed to his future self. Written, I suspected, during his illness. With trembling fingers, I opened it, unfolding a single sheet of paper. Alex. If you're reading this, you've remembered our time capsule. I hope whatever prompted you to dig it up brings you joy rather than sorrow. But knowing how life works, it might be a bit of both. I've added your mother's ring to our collection of treasures. She specifically asked that it go to you, to give to someone special when the time is right. Not necessarily for an engagement, though she would have liked that, but as a connection between past and future. Something old made new again through love. I've had a good life, son. Not a perfect one. I've made my share of mistakes, including perhaps not being as open with you about Vivian as I should have been. I never gave you much of a chance, did I? She shrugged, running her fingers along one of the emerging rosebuds. You were protecting your father, your memories of your mother. I understood that. A pause. Well, I understand it now, at least. At the time, I was too busy trying to carve out my own place in Edward's life to be particularly generous about it. The admission, honest in its self-awareness, created a momentary connection between us, two flawed people who had loved the same man in different ways. I've been thinking about your proposal, Vivian continued, about staying in the house as your tenant. And I don't think I will, not long-term, at least. She turned to face me fully. This has always been the Collins family home. I'm just An interruption in its history, the 5-year blip when Edward had a second wife. That's not fair to you, or to what you and Dad shared, I protested, surprising myself with my sudden defense of their marriage. A small, sad smile curved her lips. Life rarely is fair, Alex, but we make our choices anyway. She took a deep breath, gesturing toward the house. This place has 100 years of Colin's memories in its walls. Mine barely register in comparison. Dad wanted you to be secure, to be taken care of. And your proposal accomplishes that. The money will give me a fresh start. The rental income will provide stability while I figure out what comes next. She glanced back at the roses. But I think I'd like to find somewhere new. Somewhere without quite so many ghosts. I nodded, understanding her reasoning even as I felt an unexpected twinge of something like regret. For all our differences, Vivian had been my last connection to my father's final years. What will you do with the house? She asked. Will you move back? It was the question I'd been avoiding, the one Harold had posed earlier. What did I want from this inheritance, this responsibility? I don't know yet, I admitted. My life is in the city now. My job, my friends, but maybe someday... When you have a family of your own, she finished the thought. Future Collins generations to climb that oak tree. Maybe. The prospect seemed distant, hypothetical. I was 32, and firmly single, my last serious relationship having ended over a year ago. Vivian studied me for a moment, her expression softening into something almost maternal. He wanted that for you, you know, a family, grandchildren to spoil. He mentioned it occasionally, I admitted with a rueful smile. Usually after his third scotch at holiday dinners? She laughed, a genuine sound that I realized I'd rarely heard from her. Oh, he was less subtle with me. Practically had names picked out for your hypothetical children. The image made me chuckle despite myself. That sounds like Dad. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, an unexpected truce blossoming among Catherine's roses. Then Vivian sighed, straightening her shoulders. We should get back inside. The lawyers will be wondering what happened to us. As we turned toward the house, I felt compelled to ask the question that had been nagging at me. Vivian, why didn't you just talk to me about the financial problems, about needing to sell the house? Why try to do it behind my back? She paused, considering her answer carefully. Pride, mostly, and perhaps a bit of fear. Fear of what? That you would use it as leverage. That you would see it as confirmation that I had only married Edward for his money, and when that turned out to be less than expected, that I was cutting my losses and running. She met my gaze directly. That is what you thought, isn't it? The direct challenge made me uncomfortably aware of my own prejudices. Had I been unfair in my assessment of her motivations? I didn't know what to think, I admitted. We never really took the time to know each other. No, she agreed. We didn't. She began walking again, adding over her shoulder. But perhaps it's not too late to start. Samlept. Chapter 7. The Time Capsule. 3 weeks later, I found myself back at the house on a sunny Saturday morning, the kind of perfect late spring day that my mother used to say was made for gardening. The paperwork had been finalized, the debts paid, and the rental agreement drawn up. Vivian had decided to stay in the house for 3 more months while she looked for a new place, an arrangement that gave us both breathing room to adjust to, our new reality. I'd come today for a specific purpose, one that had been nagging at me since my first visit after seeing the sold sign. The legacy, the memories. But I don't know if I need to physically possess the house to do that. Harold nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes maintaining a connection doesn't require ownership. It requires respect for what came before, and careful stewardship of what remains. Before I could respond, Vivian returned alone, her expression unreadable as she resumed her seat across from me. Gerald is making some calls, she explained, checking on the legal implications of breaking the sale. Contract? I nodded, waiting for her to continue. I have some questions, she said, folding her hands on the table. If I choose to stay in the house as your tenant... She seemed to struggle with the word. What guarantees do I have? What prevents you from raising the rent to market rates after a year, or deciding to sell your half to someone else? They were fair questions, the same ones I would have asked in her position. We'll draw up a formal agreement, I assured her. A long-term lease with modest predetermined increases, and a right of first refusal if I ever decide to sell my share. She nodded slowly, considering this. And if I choose to leave, to start fresh somewhere else, then we hire a property management company to handle the rental. All costs and income split equally between us. You've thought this through. I tried to, I admitted, but I'm open to refinements. This isn't about winning, Vivian. It's about finding a solution we can both live with. For the first time that day, perhaps for the first time ever, she looked at me with something approaching respect. Your father would be proud of you, she said quietly. He always said you had a good head on your shoulders. Better than his sometimes. The unexpected compliment caught me off guard. He was being modest. Dad was the wisest man I knew. Sad smile crossed her face. Wise about most things. Terrible at sharing difficult truths. Like father, like son, I thought ruefully. How many difficult truths had I avoided in my own life? I accept your proposal, Vivian said suddenly, the words coming in a rush as if she feared she might change her mind. With one condition, which is the family heirlooms, the ones that remain, Edward's watch, the silver, Catherine's jewelry. I want them properly cataloged and stored, not sitting around the house as painful reminders. It was a reasonable request, and one that would actually help preserve the items properly. Agreed. We can rent a safe deposit box or perhaps even look into a climate-controlled storage facility for the larger pieces. She nodded, some of the tension visibly leaving her shoulders. Then we have a deal. As if on cue, Shepard returned, phone in hand. The buyers are understandably disappointed, but their agent indicates they would be amenable to a cancellation fee of $5,000 to cover their inspection costs and the inconvenience. A small price to pay for preserving a century of family history. Add it to the debts to be paid from the trust, I agreed. Harold was already pulling out paperwork. I'll begin drafting the necessary documents. We'll need to formalize the debt settlement, the rental agreement, the trust disbursement. Quite a bit of paperwork, I'm afraid. Shepard nodded, ever the professional, despite having just lost out on the larger commission a sale would have provided. I'll work with you to ensure Mrs. Collins' interests are properly represented. As the lawyers began discussing legal minutiae, Vivian rose from the table. I could use some air, she said. Alex, would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you. Surprised, I nodded and followed her through the kitchen and out the back door to the garden my mother had once tended so lovingly. The rain had stopped, leaving behind that unique freshness that follows a spring shower. Vivian led me along the flagstone path to a section of the garden I hadn't visited in years, a small, secluded area bordered by rose bushes that had once been my mother's pride and joy. To my surprise, while the rest of the garden had fallen into disarray, this section was immaculately maintained, the roses pruned and healthy despite the early season. I kept this part up, Vivian said quietly, noticing my surprise. Edward told me how much it meant to Catherine, to both of you. I stared at her, struggling to reconcile this gesture with the woman I'd imagined her to be. You never mentioned... What was I supposed to say? By the way, Alex, I've been tending your dead mother's roses? She shook her head. You already resented me enough for taking her place. The blunt assessment made me flinch, but I couldn't deny its essential truth. This changes the financial landscape considerably. Harold nodded in agreement. A wise suggestion. There's no need to make hasty decisions. But as the lawyers began gathering their papers, I realized that postponing would only prolong everyone's uncertainty, including the young couple eagerly waiting to purchase their dream home. Wait, I said. The word came out more forcefully than I'd intended, causing all three to look up in surprise. I don't need more time. I know what I want to do. Chapter 6. The Proposal. 3 pairs of eyes fixed on me with varying degrees of wariness, curiosity, and calculation. I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. The revelation of the second trust had changed everything and nothing. The core question remained the same. What was the right thing to do? What would honor both my father's legacy and his wishes for those he'd left behind? I have a proposal, I began, looking directly at Vivian. One that might allow us to honor Dad's wishes while addressing everyone's needs. Shepard leaned back, adopting an expression of polite skepticism. "We're listening, Mr. Collins. First, we cancel the current sale of the house." I held up a hand as Vivian started to protest. "Hear me out, please. We use the funds from the second trust to pay off all outstanding debts. The medical bills, the home equity loan, the credit cards. That immediately relieves the financial pressure." Harold nodded encouragingly. "That would leave approximately $450,000 in the trust. Next, we allocate $100,000 for the necessary repairs to the house, the roof, electrical, foundation issues. That restores the property to good condition." Vivian frowned slightly. "And then what? I continue living in a house I only half own, with no income?" "No," I said, meeting her gaze steadily. "Then we establish a fair rental value for the property. You can continue living here if you wish, but as my tenant, paying a reasonable rent that gives you security while providing me with income from my inheritance. Or, if you prefer to make a fresh start elsewhere, we can rent the entire house to a third party and split the income 50-50, as the co-owners we are." "And the remaining trust funds?" Shepard asked. Here was the crux of my proposal, the part I hoped would demonstrate good faith. "Half goes to Vivian outright, approximately $175,000. A settlement that acknowledges her marriage to my father and her care for him during his illness. The other half remains in trust for maintenance and future repairs to the house, ensuring its preservation for years to come." A stunned silence followed my words. Vivian stared at me, clearly trying to process what I was offering. "You would give me $175,000? Just like that?" she finally asked, disbelief evident in her voice. "It's not a gift," I clarified. "It's your due as Dad's widow. He wanted to ensure your security, and this accomplishes that without sacrificing the family home." Harold cleared his throat. "If I may, this proposal aligns closely with what I believe Edward would have wanted. It addresses both his desire to preserve the family legacy and his concern for his widow's welfare." Shepard, ever the pragmatist, was already calculating. "The numbers aren't quite as favorable as the sale would have been. The current offer would have left Mrs. Collins with approximately $200,000 after debts were settled. But she would have had no ongoing income from the property," I countered. "Under my proposal, she receives a substantial lump sum plus either continues living in a debt-free home at below-market rent or enjoys passive income from a rental property she co-owns." "I need to think," Vivian said suddenly, pushing back from the table. "This is a lot to process." "Of course," I nodded. "Take whatever time you need." Shepard gathered his papers. "I should review these numbers more carefully, compare the long-term financial implications of both scenarios." "I'll wait here," I told them, "when you're ready to talk again." As Vivian and Shepard retreated to the kitchen for a private consultation, Harold turned to me with an approving smile. "That was well done, Alex. A thoughtful compromise." I shrugged, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of it all. "I'm just trying to do what Dad would have wanted." "And what do you want?" Harold asked, his eyes knowing. "This isn't just about your father's wishes, after all." It was a question I'd been avoiding, focusing instead on what seemed fair. What seemed right? What did I want? The house had been a central part of my childhood, a physical connection to generations of Colin's ancestors who had lived, loved, and died within these walls. But it was also a reminder of loss, my mother's early death, my father's recent passing. "I want to preserve what matters," I said finally. The numbers were staggering. "As you can see," Shepard interjected smoothly, "the sale of the property is the most logical solution. The current offer is $875,000, which would allow Mrs. Collins to clear all debts and have a modest sum remaining, to begin rebuilding her life." I glanced at Vivian, who was staring down at her hands, her usual composure slipping to reveal genuine distress. For the first time, I felt a pang of genuine sympathy for her position. "There are other options we should consider," Harold said, catching my eye meaningfully. Now was the moment to reveal the existence of the second trust, the ace up our sleeve that could potentially change everything. But I hesitated, my father's letter fresh in my mind. "There are no villains in this story, son, only people trying to find their way forward after loss." "Before we discuss alternatives," I said carefully, "I'd like to address another matter. Vivian, several family heirlooms have disappeared from the house over the past few months. Items specifically mentioned in my mother's will as belonging to me. Vivian's head snapped up, her expression hardening. I sold some things to pay bills. Alex, to keep the lights on and the property taxes paid while I waited for the life insurance to come through. Including my great-grandmother's grandfather clock, my mother's jewelry, Dad's first edition book collection. A flush crept up her neck. The jewelry I kept, it's in the safe. The books and the clock. Yes, I sold those. I had no choice. Shepard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Perhaps we could focus on the matter at hand, the sale of the property. This is the matter at hand, I insisted. We're talking about trust and transparency. How can we have an honest conversation about the future of this house when family treasures are being sold off without consultation? What would you have had me do? Vivian's voice rose, her composure finally cracking. Call you every time a bill came due? Hello, Alex. Your father's dead. I can't pay the mortgage this month. Would you mind if I sold his grandfather's watch? Is that what you wanted? The raw pain in her voice caught me off guard. For all her cool exteriors and calculation, Vivian had been dealing with the practical realities of death, while I had the luxury of processing my grief from a distance. Harold placed a calming hand on my arm. Perhaps this would be a good time to discuss the secondary trust, he suggested quietly. Both Vivian and Shepard looked up sharply. What's secondary trust? Shepard asked, his practiced smoothness slipping for the first time. Harold opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. Edward Collins established a second trust approximately 3 months before his death. A trust with Alexander as the trustee. Vivian's face paled. What? Edward never mentioned. He kept it confidential, Harold explained gently. The trust contains certain assets that have been in the Collins family for generations, along with investments and an insurance policy separate from the one you were aware of, Vivian. How much? Shepard asked bluntly. Approximately $850,000. In liquid assets, plus family heirlooms of significant value. The silence that followed was deafening. Vivian stared at me, a complex mixture of emotions playing across her face. Shock, betrayal, confusion, and something that might have been hope. Why? She finally whispered. Why would he keep this from me? I pulled my father's letter from my briefcase, hesitating for a moment before sliding it across the table to her. He explains it better than I could. As Vivian read the letter, her hands trembling slightly, I watched the play of emotions across her face, hurt giving way to understanding, anger softening into something more complex. When she reached the end, she carefully folded the paper and returned it to me, her eyes suspiciously bright. So, she said, her voice hoarse, you get to decide, the house or my financial security. The way she phrased it made me uncomfortable. That's not exactly, but it is, isn't it? She looked directly at me now, all pretense gone. Edward left you with the power to determine my future. How convenient. Mrs. Collins, Harold interjected gently, I believe Edward's intention was to ensure that both family legacy and your welfare were considered. He trusted his son to make a thoughtful decision. A decision that affects my life far more than his, she shot back. Alex has his own home, his own career. This house is all I have left. Her words hung in the air, challenging me to deny their truth. And I couldn't. I'd built my own life in the city, while Vivian had spent the last 5 years making this house her home, only to lose both her husband and her security in the span of months. Perhaps, Shepard suggested, breaking the tense silence, we should take some time to consider the new information. Even from beyond the grave, my father was trying to mediate, to foster understanding between his son and his widow. It was so quintessentially Dad that it made my chest ache with grief renewed. When Harold returned, he found me staring out the window, the letter clutched in my hand. He knew this would happen, I said without turning around. He knew Vivian would try to sell the house, and that I would oppose it. Your father was a perceptive man, Harold replied, settling back into his chair. And he cared deeply for both of you. I turned to face him. Vivian told me there are serious structural issues with the house. Foundation problems, electrical issues, roof damage. Is that true? Harold frowned slightly. There was a home inspection done about 7 months ago, shortly after Edward's passing. It did identify some issues that need addressing, though I wouldn't characterize them as catastrophic. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I drove back to the family home. The sold sign had been removed from the front yard. At least Vivian had followed through on that much. I parked behind a sleek black BMW that I didn't recognize, presumably belonging to Gerald Shepard. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my briefcase, containing copies of all the documents Harold had given me, along with my own notes, and headed for the front door. Before I could ring the bell, it swung open to reveal a man in his mid-50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Alexander Collins? He extended his hand. Gerald Shepard. I represent Mrs. Collins in these matters. His grip was firm, his smile practiced, the kind of polished persona that came from decades of navigating high-stakes negotiations. Mr. Shepard, I nodded, following him inside. I hope you've had a chance to review the property records. Indeed I have, he replied smoothly. Quite an unusual situation we find ourselves in. Vivian was waiting in the dining room, which had been converted into an impromptu conference space. The antique mahogany table that had hosted Collins family dinners for generations was now covered with stacks of files and legal documents. Harold Abernathy sat across from her, his ancient leather briefcase open beside him. Alex, Harold stood, grasping my shoulder warmly. Good to see you. Vivian merely nodded in my direction, her expression guarded. She looked tired, with shadows under her eyes suggesting a night as restless as my own had been. Shall we begin? Shepard suggested, gesturing to the empty chair beside Harold. I took my seat, feeling the weight of generations of Collins family, members who had sat around this very table to discuss matters of inheritance, marriage, birth, and death. How many difficult conversations had these walls witnessed over the decades? I believe we're all aware of the basic situation, Shepard began, folding his hands on the table. The property at 1478 Oak Ridge Lane is jointly owned, 50%, by Mrs. Vivian Collins through the Edward Collins Living Trust, and 50% by Alexander Collins through inheritance from Catherine Collins' estate. Mrs. Collins has entered into a sale agreement with buyers who are expecting to close on Friday. However, this sale cannot proceed without Mr. Collins' consent and signature, which I'm not prepared to give, I stated firmly, at least not without a thorough understanding of the situation and exploration of alternatives. Vivian's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. That's quite reasonable, Harold interjected. Before any decisions are made, we should review the complete financial picture. Shepard nodded, sliding a folder toward the center of the table. These are the current estate financials. As you can see, there are outstanding medical bills totaling approximately $217,000, a home equity line of credit with a balance of $143,000, and credit card debt of around $32,000. I flipped through the documents, the numbers swimming before my eyes. Nearly $400,000 in debt. Far more than I'd imagined. How had Dad, always so careful with money, ended up in such dire straits? The experimental treatments, Vivian said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. They cost $15,000 a month, and insurance covered none of it. For 8 months. $120,000. Just for treatments that ultimately hadn't saved him. The realization made my chest ache. And the home equity loan? Taken out to pay for the initial rounds of treatment before we realized how bad things would get, she explained. Harold cleared his throat. If I may, there's also the matter of the house itself. I have the inspection report from 7 months ago. He placed another document on the table. There are indeed some significant issues that need addressing. The roof will need replacement within a year. The electrical system requires updating to meet current code, and there is some foundation work needed on the east side of the property. How much are we talking about? Approximately $850,000 in liquid assets, plus the heirlooms, which are difficult to value but significant. The Collins family silver alone is worth upwards of $75,000. I stared at him, stunned. And Vivian doesn't know about any of this? No. Your father's instructions were explicit. The contents of this trust were to be revealed to you first, and only to Vivian under certain conditions. What conditions? Harold tapped one of the documents. That's where it gets interesting. Edward created what we call a conditional bequest. The assets in this secondary trust can be used in one of two ways, either to preserve the family home by paying off any liens against it and funding necessary repairs, or to provide for Vivian's financial security if the house is sold. But not both. I frowned, trying to understand. So either the money goes to saving the house, or it goes to Vivian. Who decides? You do, Alex. Your father named you the trustee of this secondary trust. He felt that by the time of his death, you would be mature enough to make the right decision. One that balances family legacy with compassion. The weight of responsibility settled over me like a heavy cloak. Dad had placed an enormous amount of faith in me, faith that I would rise above any resentment toward Vivian and make a fair decision. There's more, Harold said, sliding another document toward me. This is a letter your father wrote to you, to be delivered in the event that Vivian attempted to sell the house without consulting you. With trembling fingers, I picked up the emu-sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's distinctive architect's handwriting. For a moment, I just held it, not quite ready to hear my father's voice from beyond the grave. I'll give you some privacy, Harold said, rising from his chair. Take all the time you need. Once alone in the office, I carefully broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. My dear Alex. If you're reading this, then two things have happened. I've lost my battle with this damn disease, and Vivian has made a decision about the house that has brought you into conflict. I'm sorry for both. I want you to know that I've always understood your reservations about my marriage to Vivian. You never said it outright. You're too kind for that. But a father knows his child's heart. You felt I was replacing your mother, or perhaps erasing her memory. Nothing could be further from the truth. Catherine was, and always will be, the great love of my life. But after years of loneliness, Vivian brought companionship and joy back into my days. Different kinds of love, son, but both real. Now, about the house. Your mother and I made an arrangement that I've honored. Her half of the property passed to you, while I retained the right to live there for my lifetime. I never told Vivian about this arrangement. Perhaps that was cowardly of me, but I knew it would upset her to learn that she would never fully own the home she was making with me. I suspect that after my death, Vivian will want to sell the house. It's too big for one person, too full, of Collins family ghosts for someone who isn't a Collins by blood. And I understand that you may want to keep it in the family, as generations of our ancestors have done. This puts the two people I love most in the world at odds with each other, and for that, I'm deeply sorry. The trust that Harold has just told you about gives you options. You can use those funds to preserve the family home, pay off any remaining mortgage, make necessary repairs, perhaps even buy out Vivian's half. Or you can allow Vivian to sell the house and use the trust assets to help her establish a new life, one not overshadowed by Collins family history. I won't tell you which choice to make. You're a grown man now, fully capable of weighing both the practical considerations and the emotional ones. But I will ask you to approach this decision with both your head and your heart. Consider what the house truly means to you and what your future there would look like. Consider also what Vivian has sacrificed this past year, caring for a dying man. There are no villains in this story, son, only people trying to find their way forward after loss. Whatever you decide, know that I am proud of you. You have grown into a man of integrity, thoughtfulness, and compassion, everything your mother and I hoped you would become. With all my love, Dad. I lowered the letter, my vision blurred with tears. I'd thought there were no secrets between us. But then again, Edward Collins had always been a proud man. Too proud, sometimes, to admit when he needed help. By the time I pulled into the parking garage beneath my apartment building, I'd made a decision. Instead of heading up to my condo, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. Abernathy Legal Associates, answered a crisp female voice. Hi, Sandy, it's Alex Collins. Is Harold available? Alex, it's been too long. Hold on, I'll see if he's free. A moment later, the familiar gruff voice of Harold Abernathy came on the line. Alex, my boy, I was hoping you'd call. I just left the house, I said. Saw the sold sign. Harold sighed heavily. Yes, Mrs. Collins has been quite determined to liquidate assets quickly. I've tried to advise caution, but she's not using you as her attorney anymore, I interrupted. She's hired someone named Gerald Shepard. Ah, the single syllable conveyed volumes of disapproval. I'm not surprised. Mr. Shepard has a reputation for being rather accommodating to his clients' wishes, regardless of ethical considerations. Harold, I need to know what's going on. Vivian claims Dad left a mountain of debt, that the house needs major repairs, that everything is falling apart financially. Is that true? There was a pause on the line. It's complicated, Alex. Your father's illness certainly took a toll on his finances, and yes, there is debt. But the situation may not be quite as dire as Mrs. Collins suggests. I need to see everything, all the financial records, the trust documents, everything. Of course, but you should know there are certain aspects of your father's estate that are sensitive. Things he asked me not to disclose unless absolutely necessary. A cold weight settled in my stomach. What things, Harold? I think this is a conversation best had in person. Can you come to my office? I glanced at my watch. My meeting with a potential client was in 2 hours. Plenty of time. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Harold Abernathy's office looked exactly as it had when my father first brought me there as a child. Wood-paneled walls lined with law. Books, a massive oak desk piled high with folders and documents, and the ever-present smell of pipe tobacco, though Harold had officially quit smoking years ago. The man himself had aged, however. At 72, his once robust frame had grown thinner, his white hair sparser, but his sharp blue eyes had lost none of their keenness as he regarded me over the rim of his reading glasses. You look like him, you know, he said as I took a seat across from his desk. More and more every year. Same stubborn set to the jaw. I smiled despite myself. Mom always said that was her least favorite feature we shared. Harold chuckled, then his expression grew serious. Alex, before we get into the details, I need to ask, what exactly are your intentions regarding the house? I want to honor my parents' wishes, I said without hesitation. They wanted the house to stay in the family. He nodded slowly. And what about Mrs. Collins? Your stepmother? The question gave me pause. What did I want for Vivian? Truthfully, I'd spent so much time resenting her presence in my father's life and her apparent eagerness to erase our family's history after his death that I hadn't given much thought to her welfare. I don't want to leave her destitute, I finally said. If Dad really did leave debts, I'm willing to help address them, but I won't let her sell off my family's legacy out from under me. Harold studied me for a moment, then nodded as if I'd passed some sort of test. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick file folder. Your father came to see me 3 months before he died, he said, opening the folder. He knew by then that the treatments weren't working, that his time was limited. He wanted to put certain contingencies in place. What kind of contingencies? Harold removed several documents from the folder and laid them out on the desk. Edward was concerned about what would happen between you and Vivian after he was gone. He loved you both, but he wasn't blind to the tension. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. Dad and I had never directly discussed my feelings about his second marriage, but he must have sensed my reservations. He created a second trust, Harold continued, one that Vivian doesn't know about. A secret trust? Is that even legal? Completely legal, though admittedly unusual. It contains assets that were solely in your father's name. Investments, an insurance policy that Vivian isn't aware of, certain family heirlooms that he specifically wanted preserved for future generations. My mind reeled. Then there is no sale. Not unless you want to pursue a partition action, which would force a sale through court order. But that's a lengthy and expensive process, and given the family relationship, I wouldn't recommend it. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. Thank you, Gerald. I'll call you back. She ended the call, and we stood in silence for a long moment, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, one of the few original pieces that remained, the only sound in the room. So, I finally said, what do we do now? Selfa so. Chapter 3. The will. Vivian didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the large picture window overlooking the backyard, her arms wrapped around herself as if warding off a chill. Following her gaze, I could see the garden that had once been my mother's pride and joy, now overgrown in some areas, bare in others, a shadow of its former glory. "I had plans," she said quietly, still facing the window. "The money from this sale was going to help me start over, get out from under all this debt." Despite everything, I felt a twinge of sympathy. Vivian had spent the last year of Dad's life as his caretaker, watching the vibrant, charismatic man she'd married wither away. Whatever my feelings about her, that couldn't have been easy. "How bad is it?" I asked. "The financial situation." She turned to face me, and for the first time, I noticed the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the slight slump in her usually perfect posture. "Bad enough that I've been losing sleep for months. Your father left considerable debt, Alex. The medical bills alone?" She shook her head. "The life insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough." "And the trust? Dad must have had investments, savings. Most of it went to his care, the experimental treatments in Houston, the specialists, the medications. Insurance wouldn't cover." Her lips quirked in a sad approximation of a smile. "Your father was never one to give up without a fight." No, he wasn't. That determination, some might call it stubbornness, was a defining Collins trait, one I'd inherited in full measure. "I need to see the financial records," I said, "all of them. And I want Harold involved. He's known our family finances for decades." Vivian's expression tightened. "I don't see why that's necessary. Gerald is perfectly capable. This isn't negotiable, Vivian. If we're going to figure this out, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. From someone I trust." She looked like she wanted to argue further, but instead gave a curt nod. "Fine, but I want Gerald present as well." "Fair enough." I glanced at my watch. "I need to get back to the city for a meeting, but I can come back tomorrow. We can go through everything then." "Tomorrow," she agreed. 10 o'clock. As I turned to leave, a thought occurred to me. The Byers, the young couple with twins on the way. Have you told them yet? About the complication? Vivian's hesitation told me everything. Not yet. I wanted to speak with Gerald first. "You should call them. It's not fair to let them keep thinking they've found their dream home if there's a chance the sale won't go through." "I'll handle it," she said stiffly. I nodded and headed for the door, but paused in the entryway. The antique mirror that had hung there since my great-grandparents' time was gone, another piece of Collins history removed. "Oh, and Vivian, the family heirlooms you've been selling, the grandfather clock, Dad's first edition books, Mom's jewelry, we need to talk about those too." Her expression remained carefully neutral. Those items were left to me in the trust. Were they? All of them? I raised an eyebrow, because I have a copy of Mom's will, and it specifically mentions several items that were meant to pass to me. Items that seem to have disappeared from this house in the last 8 months. For a split second, something like guilt flashed across her features before her composure reasserted itself. "We can discuss that tomorrow as well?" "Good." I opened the front door, then turned back one last time. "And Vivian, the sold sign needs to come down. Today." With that, I walked out, letting the heavy oak door close behind me with a satisfying thud. Chapter 4. Allies and Adversaries. The drive back to the city gave me time to think, to process, the whirlwind of revelations from the past 24 hours. As I navigated through traffic, my mind kept circling back to one troubling question. If Dad had really been in such dire financial straits, why hadn't he told me? We'd always been close, especially after Mom died. Dad didn't think it mattered at the time. He assumed he'd live a lot longer than he did. And honestly, I think he avoided difficult conversations whenever possible. You must have noticed that about him. A reluctant smile tugged at her lips, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her today. He once postponed telling me about a fishing trip with his college buddies until the day before he left. Said he was looking for the right moment to bring it up. I chuckled despite myself. That sounds like Dad. For a brief moment, we shared something rare, a connection over our mutual understanding of the man we'd both loved in different ways. But the moment quickly faded as Vivian's expression hardened again. Even if what you're saying is true, Alex, the sale is already in process. The buyers have secured financing. They're expecting to move in next month. I understand that complicates things, but legally, they can't buy this house without my signature on the deed transfer. What is it you want? She asked bluntly. Money? Is that it? You want your cut of the sale? The accusation stung, though I shouldn't have been surprised. Vivian had always viewed relationships through a transactional lens. This isn't about money, I said, though in some ways it was. Just not in the way she meant. It's about respecting Dad's wishes. And Mom's. They wanted this house to stay in the family. Your father's wishes? Vivian stood abruptly, her composure cracking. His wish was for me to be taken care of after he was gone. He promised me that. Instead, I'm left with mountains of medical bills, estate taxes I can barely afford, and a house that's falling apart faster than I can maintain it. I blinked, taken aback by her outburst. What are you talking about? Dad had excellent insurance, and this house is in great shape. He was meticulous about maintenance. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh, Alex, you really have no idea, do you? About what? Your father's finances were a disaster. The insurance barely covered half the medical expenses. The experimental treatments he insisted on trying, those weren't covered at all. And this house? She gestured around us. The foundation is cracking. The roof needs to be completely replaced. The electrical system is so outdated, it's practically a fire hazard. I stood too, struggling to process what she was saying. That can't be right. Dad was always careful with money. He would have told me if things were that bad. Would he? The man who couldn't even tell me about a fishing trip until the last minute? The man who spent his entire life avoiding difficult conversations? She shook her head. He was protecting you, Alex. Just like he always did. The words hit me like a physical blow. Could she be right? Had Dad been hiding financial troubles? From both of us? It seemed impossible. Edward Collins had been a successful architect, prudent with investments, cautious with spending. But then again, cancer treatment was expensive, and I remembered how he'd sometimes changed the subject when I asked about work in the last year of his life. If that's true, I said slowly, then we need to look at all the financials together. Figure this out as a family? There is no family, Alex, Vivian replied, her voice tired now rather than angry. There's just you and me, two people who happen to love the same man, and now I'm trying to salvage what I can from the mess he left behind. The harshness of her words made me flinch, but before I could respond, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. It's Gerald, my lawyer. Put him on speaker, I said. She hesitated, then nodded, answering the call. Gerald, I'm here with Edward's son, Alex. You're on speaker. Mrs. Collins, came a crisp male voice. I've reviewed the property records for the Oak Ridge Lane house. I'm afraid there's a complication with the sale. Vivian's eyes met mine. What kind of complication? It appears that ownership of the property is split. You inherited your husband's 50% share through the trust, but the other half belongs to Alexander Collins. It's been in his name since 2012, following the terms of Catherine Collins' will. The confirmation hung in the air between us. I could almost see Vivian's mind racing, recalculating, adjusting her strategy. So, what does this mean for the sale? She asked, her voice carefully controlled. Simply put, you cannot sell the property without Mr. Collins' consent. Both of you would need to sign the transfer deed. And if Alex refuses to sign? Gerald's sigh was audible through the phone. At 42, Vivian Mercer was objectively beautiful, the kind of woman who turned heads when she entered a room. That was how she'd caught my father's attention 5 years ago at a charity gala, dazzling him with her charm and sophistication, after his 3 years of loneliness following Mom's death. You're still here, she said, her heels clicking against the cobblestone path as she approached. Not a question, but an accusation. I stood, brushing dirt from my jeans. I thought we should talk in person. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she glanced at the sold sign, then back to me. There's nothing to discuss, Alex. The sale is happening. Friday. Did you check the deed yet? She adjusted her sunglasses, a nervous habit I'd noticed over the years. I've left messages for Gerald. Gerald? I frowned. Dad's lawyer is Harold Abernathy. Gerald Shepard is my attorney, she corrected, emphasizing the possessive pronoun. I hired him to handle the estate matters. Of course she had. Harold Abernathy had been my father's friend for 30 years. He'd never allow Vivian to pillage the estate the way she clearly intended to. Well, when Gerald calls you back, he'll confirm what I've told you. I own half this house, Vivian. It's not yours to sell. She removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were colder than I remembered. Your father would be very disappointed in you right now, trying to block me from moving on with my life. The manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. Dad had been many things. Stubborn, sometimes distant, occasionally too wrapped up in his work, but he'd been fiercely devoted to family legacy, to preserving the past while building for the future. Dad is the one who agreed to this arrangement with Mom, I reminded her. He knew exactly what he was doing when he signed those papers. Vivian's expression flickered, a momentary crack in her composure. What papers? What arrangement? I hesitated. There was something in her voice, genuine confusion perhaps, that made me reconsider my approach. As much as I resented what she was doing, escalating the conflict wouldn't help either of us. Let's go inside, I suggested. I'll explain everything. She seemed to debate internally before giving a curt nod and heading toward the front door. I followed, feeling a strange blend of familiarity and alienation as we entered the house where I'd grown up. The entryway still had the same antique console table that had been there since my grandfather's time, but the family photos that had once adorned it were gone, replaced by minimalist art pieces that screamed Vivian rather than Collins. Would you like something to drink? She asked stiffly, more out of obligation than genuine hospitality. Water's fine, thanks. As she disappeared into the kitchen, I took the opportunity to look around. The living room had been completely redecorated. Gone were Dad's comfortable leather armchairs, replaced by sleek modern furniture in shades of gray and white. The fireplace mantel, once crowded with family photographs spanning generations, now held only a large abstract sculpture and a few strategic tea lights. It was as if she'd been systematically erasing our family's presence, turning the historic Collins home into a generic showcase that could have belonged to anyone. Here, Vivian said, returning with a glass of water. She gestured toward the sofa. Sit. I took a seat, noticing that even the familiar creaking of the floorboards seemed muted somehow, as if the house itself was being silenced. Vivian perched on the edge of an armchair across from me, back straight, ankles crossed. The picture of controlled composure. So, she said, these papers you mentioned. I set my water down on a coaster, at least some of Dad's habits had, rubbed off on her, and leaned forward. When Mom was diagnosed with cancer, she and Dad had a lot of difficult conversations about the future, about what would happen after she was gone. A flash of something, irritation, discomfort, crossed Vivian's features at the mention of my mother. Catherine Collins had been dead for 8 years before Vivian entered our lives, but her presence had always seemed to unnerve my stepmother nonetheless. Mom wanted to make sure that the house would stay in the family, I continued. It meant everything to her. It had been in the Collins family for 4 generations. So she and Dad made an arrangement. She left her half of the house to me in her will, with the understanding that Dad could live here for the rest of his life. But legally, I've owned 50% of this property since I was 20. Vivian's carefully manicured nails tapped against the arm of her chair. If that's true, why hasn't this come up before now? Why didn't your father mention this when we got married? It was a fair question, and one I'd asked Harold myself. He put everything in a trust. I'm the trustee. Almost everything, I corrected her, except this house. What are you talking about? The house is part of the estate. I have the papers, right? You have papers showing Dad's half of the house, I interrupted, keeping my voice calm despite the hammering of my heart. But not Mom's half. When she died, she left her portion to me. Dad could live in it for his lifetime, but the deed transfer was recorded years ago. I own 50% of the property, Vivian. You can't sell it without my signature. The silence that followed told me everything. She hadn't known. Dad had never told her about this arrangement, this final gift from my mother to ensure I would always have a connection to our family home. That's ridiculous, she finally sputtered. Your father would have mentioned, it's all in the county records. I'm looking at the deed right now, actually. Dad's lawyer sent me a copy yesterday. My name is right there, clear as day. Has been for 12 years. I could hear papers shuffling on the other end. This is some kind of mistake. No mistake. And neither was the way you've been selling off family heirlooms without consulting me. The grandfather clock that belonged to my great-grandmother, Dad's collection of first editions, all those things were meant to stay in the family. Harold had mentioned this too, how Vivian had been systematically liquidating assets from the estate, some of which weren't even hers to sell. The grandfather clock had been specifically mentioned in my mother's will as an item that should pass to me. I needed the money to fund your spa retreat in Arizona, the one you put a deposit on last week. Yeah, the lawyer mentioned that too. I sat down on the stone bench beneath the oak tree, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't how I wanted things to go after Dad died. But Vivian had made her intentions clear from the day of the funeral, when she'd asked me to clear out my childhood belongings because she was thinking of redecorating. So what happens now? She finally asked, her voice hard. Now we have a conversation about respect, family legacy, and doing right by Dad's memory, I said. I'm not unreasonable, Vivian. I understand you need to move on. But this house, and everything in it, isn't just yours to dispose of. You can't. Stop the sale. I have buyers. I can and I will, unless we come to an arrangement that honors what Dad would have wanted. I looked up at the second-floor window that had been my bedroom, where Dad had painted stars on the ceiling that glowed in the dark. Dad always said this place should stay in the family, that someday my kids would climb the same oak tree he climbed as a boy. The line went quiet again. Then, in a smaller voice than I'd ever heard from her, I didn't know. No, you didn't, I agreed. But now you do, so let's figure this out together, shall we? As family, the way Dad would have wanted. I hung up and slipped the phone back into my pocket, then walked to the base of the old oak tree. Kneeling down, I found the spot, where we'd buried the time capsule, marked by a small rock with my childish handprint pressed into cement. Inside that metal box were photos of Mom, letters we'd written to our future selves, and the original copy of my mother's will, the one that spelled out precisely how this house would remain a legacy for generations to come. Dad had always told me that houses have souls, that they remember the people who've loved them. As I stood on the lawn looking up at the place where I'd grown up, I could almost hear the echoes of laughter from decades past. Don't worry, I whispered to the house, to my parents, to the ghosts of all the Collins family members who had walked these grounds. I won't let her forget who this house belongs to. Chapter 2. Buried Memories. I was kneeling by the oak tree, my fingers tracing the outline of the cement handprint when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. Looking up, I saw a sleek black Mercedes pulling into the driveway, parking right behind my modest Honda. The contrast between our vehicles seemed to perfectly symbolize the difference between Vivian's world and mine. She emerged from the car, like a storm cloud, designer sunglasses perched on her nose despite the overcast day. Her caramel-highlighted hair swept into an immaculate updo. The sold sign was like a knife to my chest. I slammed on the brakes of my Honda Civic, the tires screeching against the pavement of Maple Avenue. For a moment, I sat frozen behind the wheel, staring at the red and white placard driven into the front lawn of 1478 Oak Ridge Lane. My childhood home, my father's house, my family's legacy. The same lawn where Dad had taught me to throw a baseball, where Mom had planted tulips every spring until her illness made it impossible. How could this be happening? Dad's funeral had been only 8 months ago. With trembling hands, I pushed, opened the car door, and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. A breeze sent fallen leaves skittering across the cobblestone walkway as I approached the house, my footsteps feeling heavier with each stride. The majestic oak tree in the front yard, the one my great-grandfather had planted when he built this house in 1923, stood as a silent witness to generations of my family's history. And now it was being sold off without so much as a phone call to me. The cedar porch swing still creaked the same way it had when I was 10, when Mom would push me on summer evenings while fireflies danced across the lawn. I sat on it now, 20 years later, feeling the familiar groan of the chains against the porch ceiling. Running my fingers along the armrest, I could still feel the small heart I'd carved with my pocket knife when I was 12. A+M for Alex and Mom. She'd scolded me for damaging the swing, then kissed the top of my head and said it made the swing even more special. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen displayed a name I'd grown to dread seeing. Vivian Mercer. No longer Vivian Mercer Collins, I noticed. She'd wasted no time dropping Dad's surname after the funeral. I took a deep breath and answered. Hello? Alex? Is that your car in the driveway? What are you doing at the house? Vivian's voice had that manufactured sweetness she'd perfected, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Even through the phone, I could detect the artificial warmth that had fooled my father, but never me. Just saying goodbye, I said, running my fingers along the weathered arm of the swing. Congratulations on the sale. That was fast. Well, the market is hot right now. I need to downsize, you understand? Too many memories. Too many memories, or too many reminders that she was merely the most recent occupant of a home with nearly a century of history that had nothing to do with her. Vivian had always seemed uncomfortable with the photographs on the walls, the heirlooms in the china cabinet, the weathered leather-bound books in Dad's study that had belonged to his father. Everything that made the house a Collins. Home seemed to irritate her, like sand in an oyster. Except in this case, no pearl had formed from the irritation. Only resentment. I understand completely, I lied. When's the closing? Friday. The new owners are eager. Young couple with twins on the way. A pause. You should have called before coming. I could have saved you the trip. What she meant was, I could have made sure I wasn't home when you came by. In the 8 months since Dad's death, I'd visited exactly twice. Both times, Vivian had made excuses to be elsewhere. It's no trouble. Dad's lawyer called me yesterday about some paperwork. Thought I'd stop by while I was in town. The silence on the other end stretched until Vivian cleared her throat. What paperwork? I smiled to myself, feeling a small spark of satisfaction ignite in my chest. Harold Abernathy, my father's longtime attorney and friend, had called yesterday, with news that had kept me awake all night. Just some deed issues that need clearing up. Deed issues? There aren't any deed issues. I have the paperwork right here. I stood up from the swing and walked toward the oak tree where my father and I had buried our time capsule 23 years ago. The ground was soft from yesterday's rain, and I felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with grief as I recalled that day. I'd been 8 years old, and Dad had helped me collect treasures to preserve for the future. Baseball cards, a Hot Wheels car, a photo of our family, Mom, Dad, and me, taken before Mom's diagnosis. We'd sealed it all in a weatherproof metal box, along with letters to our future selves. Actually, there are, I said into the phone. Did Dad ever tell you about his estate plan? The one he set up after Mom died? Another pause. Longer this time, I asked, genuinely curious about her relationship with David, which seemed to be thriving despite its unlikely beginnings. Perhaps, she allowed, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Fragmento. 22. Moving in with David feels right, in a way I couldn't have anticipated 6 months ago. Life has its own timeline, Alex. After we hung up, I wandered through the house, eventually finding myself in the dining room, staring up at the stained glass windows Emma had taught me to truly see. The afternoon sun transformed the colored panes into jewels, casting blues and greens and golds across the hardwood floors in patterns that had danced through this room for a century. My father had once told me that houses absorb the emotions of the people who live in them, joy and sorrow, love and loss, all becoming part of the structure itself. This house had witnessed 4 generations of Colin's beginnings and endings. Perhaps it was ready for something new, something unexpected. Perhaps I was, too. Chapter 12. Full Circle. The following Tuesday dawned bright and clear, the first truly spring-like day after months of Pacific Northwest gloom. I found myself unusually anxious as the afternoon approached, rehearsing what I might say to Emma when she arrived. After considerable reflection, I decided to accept her invitation, to see where this unexpected connection might lead. The upset realization that my hesitation stemmed more from fear of change than any legitimate concern had been humbling but clarifying. At precisely 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath and opened the door to find not Emma, but an elderly gentleman standing on my porch. He was tall and distinguished, with snow-white hair and alert blue eyes that seemed vaguely familiar. "Can I help you?" I asked, momentarily disoriented by the unexpected visitor. "I certainly hope so," the man replied with a faint New England accent. I'm looking for Alexander Collins. That's me. He extended a hand. Robert Harland. I believe you're acquainted with my granddaughter, Emma Reeves. Understanding dawned. This was Emma's grandfather, whose name I'd heard mentioned during our conversations about her family. But why would he be visiting me? Mr. Harland, yes, of course. Please come in. As I led him into the living room, he moved with the deliberate care of someone in his 80s, but his gaze was sharp as it took in the details of the house.